Hello and welcome back to the Django Class Views series. Here in this mini series, we're looking solely at the class views in Django. So we start off looking at the generic views that are built into Django, and eventually we'll move on to building our own class views. So this is the third tutorial in the series. Here we're going to focus on DetailView. So the Django generic view, DetailView. So building on the knowledge that we've already obtained in the previous tutorials, here we're going to focus on the detail view. So first of all, we'll start off giving you a general overview of when you might want to utilize the detail view. So next I'll give you some additional information, and we'll have a look at together the MRO and have a look at the detail view and what it inherits in terms of the methods and attributes that it inherits. And that will give us a better understanding of how the detail view works. Of course, while we're doing this, we'll also cover a basic example utilizing the detail view. And like in the other tutorials, I'll add in and show you some of the attributes that you can apply and utilize within the detail view. So let's start looking at the application of the detail view. So the essence of this, the simplicity of this is that this is a view that you would use to present detail of a single model instance. So you can actually write this view in only one line, just specifying the model that you want to use, the data that you want to use. So we'll have a look at that in the example. So this is intended to be used with one object only. So you're probably familiar with this type of scenario. You have a list of items on a single page. You then click on one item, and that then takes you to that individual item's details. So that might be a blog item, so a blog post. That might be a book in a list. You click on the book, that takes you to the individual page. So that individual page is going to be managed and created utilizing the detail view. So an important thing to understand straight away about utilizing the detail view is it must be called on an object primary key or slug in the URL. So here in the example here, you can see that we're utilizing the primary key. So there are two options here, the primary key and the slug. And we do have to be very specific in that we have to use the PK or SLUG, the slug. So we have to be very specific in what we call. So we'll have a look at why that is later in the tutorial. So what you're going to find eventually is that there's not really any technical reason to prefer one generic view over the other in some cases. Sometimes it's just a case of you might end up writing more code if you use one approach than the other approach. So I don't want to make this sound explicit, but typically you wouldn't use this view for if you had a page with a form, if you used it to return, update data in the database, and generally you wouldn't use this view if you wanted to use pagination. So as I'm just going to reiterate, sometimes there is an argument that could be made equally for different approaches or different views. So sometimes it's really just your judgment in what you want to utilize in terms of the generic views. And then finally, I'll say that eventually you're going to outgrow these generic views and you'll want to add custom methods to the views. Then you'll just end up utilizing and creating your own class. So just to recap a previous tutorial, if you remember, we looked at the template view, and here the view inherits the methods and attributes from three of these views here. So the template resource mixin, the context mixin, and the view. So let's have a look at the detail view. So you can see here it's a little bit more busy. There's much more inherited here into the detail view. A point to make out here is that generally so far we've been importing from the base and then the view. So here you can see we actually now have the generic detail single object mixin, for example, and the base here and the single object template here all coming from the detail and not the base. So that's important to remember when you import this in to your view. Okay, so for now, this is just for a reference. We'll draw back, or we'll come back to this as we start writing out the view. And in addition to that, let's have a look at the MRO for this. So the method flowchart for this, you can see this is quite busy. This really just reflects the amount of inheritance that the detail view has. You can see that there's a lot more methods here in this flowchart. So after a while, you get to look at this method and you can start to see what this is trying to do, or you can start to connect to what these different methods might actually be providing. So for example, we're familiar with the HTTP method not allowed and the setup and the dispatch. We've seen that before in the other views. And that just reflects the fact that the detail view is also utilizing the view and the template response mixing. And the other views that we've already mentioned, that was also utilizing those too. So we have some of the similar functionality which the template view has, but obviously here it's extended to utilize other tools. Okay, so let's get to the code. I'm going to start off by building a new app here called Books. So I'm going to go for a different example here. Okay. And now I'm going to create a simple model for this. So go ahead and build a simple model here. We've got the books model, title slug, genre, author, ISBN, and count. So I'm going to create a little counter, and you can see it's important that we include a slug because we're going to be utilizing that. So let's go over to the URLs and create some URLs. So I need to add a new file here called URLs. So this mini system we're creating is going to have two URLs. First of all, for the index page, which is just going to show, let's change that. It's just going to show all the books in my database, and then obviously the detail view. So when I click on the book, it's going to take me to the detail view, and this is this path here. Now notice here we're going to actually be utilizing the detail view. So we need to either define the slug, or we can also additionally define the ID. Of course, we can actually also define the ID and the slug if we wanted to. So for example, we could do something like that. Obviously with the slug on this side and the ID on that side and so on. But there doesn't seem to be any real reason to do that. So let's just stick with, in this case, we're going to utilize the slug in the database. Of course, if you're wondering what a slug is, that's going to become a lot clearer shortly. So don't worry about that. So next up, let's go into the core application and just make sure that we've actually included this in the apps. So this is called Books. And then I need to link the URLs. So go ahead and link your URLs. So here I need to link to the books, and I'm going to give it a namespace of books. So we go ahead and do that. So that just links up our, I need a comma here. That just links up our URLs to our books app. And now we can go into the views. So let's go into the view and let's just create a view. So based upon the knowledge that we have so far in this series, I'm going to base the views that we create on that. So not necessarily correspond to what we potentially might utilize. So here, for example, for the index view, I'm just going to be utilizing a template view. So we go ahead and import that in. Apologies, my voice is falling apart today. So we've got template view. So next up, so let me just explain this quickly. We've got a template view. That's going to take in the template name. So actually, let's just build a quick template for that. So I'll build a new folder here called templates. Yep. And then inside of that, I'll need a new file called home.html. Okay, so that links that up. Let me just close everything here. Okay, so back in the views here, you can see that we're going to be utilizing some context. So here, what's context? So context is just additional information we want to pass back to the template. It kind of is as simple as that, really. We will explain a little bit more about the context data, I think in later tutorials, but essentially here, this is a method that's brought in, inherited in, and to the template view, and we can utilize this to basically just pass data back, or additional data back to the template. So here you can see we basically just set up essentially a variable called books, or a data point called books, and we just put some data inside of it. And here we're just getting all the data from the books object, the books table, and we're just putting it into this object here that we're creating, and then through the context we'll just pass the context back, the context data, which is right here, back to our template, and there we have it. So in our template we can reference this data. You'll see this through this keyword books. So we can get all this data through the keyword books in the context when we go back to the template. Okay, so here is the problem, that we need to now import the books model into our project. So we'll do that. So that imports the books model, and I think that's pretty much that done. So this is just going to be a simple page. Now let's just give that a go. Let's go into the server here, see if we can get that working. So there seems to be a problem. Cannot import name book detail view from books view, and that's on the redirect. So let's just make sure that we're doing the right thing here. So in the URLs we are importing this, and this doesn't actually exist yet. That's what the problem is. So let's just get rid of this for now so we can just see this working. Let's go to the page and then refresh. So obviously there's nothing in our database at the moment. So I'm just going to quickly go into my admin. So create a super user. I'm just going to go into the admin and create some new data. So if you don't know how to do that, just type in py, manage py, and create super user. It will ask you a few questions. Just add the details, and that will create an account, or an admin account. So obviously before we start doing that, there's a few things that we need to do. So let me just cancel that. Obviously we need to migrate the database. So let's go ahead and migrate the database. And then migrate. There seems to be a problem here, but I think we'll be okay. Okay, so I did have a few errors, but I've sorted it out. So go head over to the admin and just make sure that you, well, first of all, migrate, make migrations, and then migrate your database. And then just head over to the admin of your books and just make sure that you register your books table in the admin so we can access the table and add some data. And here I'm going to add a pre-populated field, the slug, and you're going to see why that is in a second. So once you've done that, make sure you've got a super user. Let's head in now to the admin, and let's just build some data. So I've already added 4 books here. So you can see that in the books here, well, let's just save and add another. As soon as I type something here, you notice that the slug is being generated. So this is a slug, a URL friendly string that we can utilize to pass as a URL in your browser, and we're going to also utilize this to match the URL to the post so that we know what single post that we want to display. So that makes sense shortly if you're not too familiar with that approach. So here I'm just going to say new data. So notice that when I just type in new data, it slugifies the text here, the string, and utilizes the dash, because obviously in a URL in our browser here, we can't actually use a space. So it slugifies the data here. So let's just call this new data and so on. And if I click that again, or start again, that's going to then be populated. Well, it should be populated. Okay, so that's roughly how that works there. So just create some more data. Like I said, I've already created 4 items. So let's go back to the books. We don't need that anymore. And you can see now we have all these different books. Obviously, the last step you need to do is go into your home HTML page and just make sure you've added some styling. You can see from here, I've just added some bootstrap elements. So by all means, copy that. It's obviously in the repository that you can download. So this code is in the repository here. You'll notice that I'm extending from the base. So I've created a base here, and I'm extending this content block here, or I'm adding the content from home into the content block to generate the full HTML page if you're not familiar with the Django template system. Okay, so that's what we got so far then. So let's now move into the book detail view. Let's first of all have a look at the whole thing that we've created here. So you can see that we've included in our detail view, obviously we're importing this in from details here, remember. So you can see here that we're utilizing the model. So that's the first thing that we define. So we simply say what model we want to use. Now, if I were to remove all of this here and just then make sure in my URL, I'm utilizing the slug, name, book name, or book detail, and then I'm importing in the book detail view. So that's what we need to change in the slug here, or in the URLs. So I'm passing in the slug. So let's go back into our page and refresh. If I click here, you can see at the bottom left what the actual URL is at the bottom here, and it's using the slug of the book to generate this URL. So when I click on it, it's going to pass in the slug across to my view and then utilize that to actually find the individual post. Now it says here that the template does not exist, so books, book detail. Now that's important to understand. So notice it says books underscore detail. Template does not exist. Now if we go back into the view, by default, Django is going to create a default template to utilize. And you can see what it's trying to find. So if we don't actually specify a template here, Django will actually define a template for us. So ideally, we obviously want to control what template we want to use. But if we were to change our book detail to what it requires, so underscore. So I'm never too comfortable utilizing underscore as a name for a file for a web page, but we'll go ahead and do that. So if we go back here in our page and refresh, so sorry, books detail, and we need an S. Let's rename that with an S. Obviously, this is going to show the details. So I've still got it wrong. So books detail. But notice also it's looking for a folder, books. So in actual fact, I need to create a new folder, apologies, called book. And then I'll put that into there, move that in across. And then obviously now the base won't work. So I need to just move that back one and then refresh. And it still doesn't work because it's books. Honestly, I'm going to get this right in a minute. I'm not trying to waste your time. Okay, this time. Yes. Okay. So it's not returning any data at the moment, but it's working. So now we've got the page working. I do apologize again. I might edit that out. So what's happening here is that we're now returning data onto this page. So this is the second important thing we need to understand. If we want to just utilize this view as is, just by the model, we need to remember two things. Django is going to generate a template name for us. So we need to be careful what it's going to generate. And also, we also need to use a different context here to gather the data. So inside of here, I've defined that my data that's returned is going to be in the book. So the data is going to be referenced as book, but by default it's referenced as object. So if we don't define anything in the view, we can access the data via object. So when we go back now and I refresh, you can see that that data is available. So again, if we want to use this view, you can see how simple it is. We just simply need to write one line as long as we follow the rules of Django, creating our template and how we reference the data in our template. So that's really the base or the underpinning knowledge to understand about utilizing data view or detail view, sorry. So let's just go back to what we had here. So let's just move back our template. And then we've created we utilize the attribute here, template name. So here we're actually defining our template. So let's just rename this. So we've defined our template, and we've also now defined the context object name. So this is going to overwrite the need for us to type in object to gather the data. Here we're going to create a context object name, which is a name that we're going to define or give to the data that we're returning. So now it's called book. When we go back into our detail page here, instead of using object, we can now just use book. That's how we're going to access our data. And of course, we just extend that and gather the data that we want corresponding to the data that we have defined in our model and in the database. So that's all good. So we'll pass that in. So next up then we have the get context data. So this might not be enough for you. So you might want to add additional data or include additional data into your view, into the template. So we can extend the template or this view, by adding get context data. So if we have a look at the MRO here, we can see that we have the get context data at the bottom here. Okay, so if we have a look at what's being included into the detail view, you can see that I actually made a mistake earlier. Trying to remember off the top of my head. It was actually the single object mixin. I mixed it up earlier, I believe. So this is where we're getting the context from, or the ability to utilize context from the single object mixin. So what we can do is go into the Django documentation. We can have a look at the single object mixin, and then we can have a look at all the different details that it provides us. And if we move down the bottom here, we have the get context data. So if you wanted to learn a little bit more, it's just a case of following the documentation and start reading. And then it'll probably send you to somewhere else and so on. But there are some really good information here, which is going to be useful for you then to drill down to more information. Now, if I were to try and tell you every single thing here, obviously you can see this is going to take a couple of hours potentially on a video. So definitely go ahead and just explore some of these details. And this is really going to help you expand your knowledge of what's available and the capabilities of class-based views. Or at least the generic class-based views, remember, in Django. So let's take a look at what we're doing here. In our model, we have the count, which is just an integer field, which we can increment. So you can see here what we're doing. We're taking in, or we're utilizing the slug further. We're getting the slug. And then what we're doing here, we're just using our f expression to create a query on the database, which is going to basically find what's the data inside the count and just increment it by 1. So every time someone comes to this page, we're essentially just making a very simplistic page counter. And after that, we then add the context. So here you can see that we've just created a new data point here, time, and I've just used the time now, which I've imported up the top here, and it's just going to get the current time. It's just an example for you, and we're now going to send that back to the template. So if we go into the template, you can see here I've outputted the time right there, referenced by the time string. So just to finish off then, we type in, or we utilize a link, or we've created a link. So let's have a look at that in the home. So here we've created a link. It's from the books, the book detail, and then we pass in the slug. So we get the slug from the book information that we pass to this page. So we extend and we create our URL like that on our page. So that then creates the page right here. And so these are all links now. And we click on that, and that then would take us to our single page. Let me just change the base back. That takes us to our single page, and you can see here we've got the time and the other information that we've asked to print out. So hopefully that gives you a basic overview of utilizing the details view, the generic details view in Django. Okay, so there we have it. That didn't go as smooth as what I hoped it to go, but hopefully you get the general feel for utilizing this detail view. Again, I do recommend you go and have a look at the documentation just to drill down on some of these different methods that are being inherited. Even if you just spent a little bit of time exploring some of these, once you start building your own classes, we'll potentially utilize some of this functionality. So it's useful to know as much as you possibly can, of course. Then I do apologize again for getting the single object mixing incorrect. I did have it correct down the bottom here. I'm not entirely sure what happened there. So that's obviously important to understand what's being imported here, and that's going to give you a flavor of what tools are available in this view. And obviously we based our generic view, or deciding what generic view to use, based upon the tools that we need to achieve the or aims of our application. Okay, so thank you very much for listening, and I'll see you in the next tutorial.